It was December 29, 1972, and Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, took off from JFK Airport in New York, bound for Miami, Florida. The aircraft was relatively new, a state-of-the-art model at the time, and the flight was routine, or so it seemed. The passengers settled in their seats, the crew prepared for the journey, and everything appeared as normal as any other flight. But within minutes of takeoff, something small but critical went wrong. The nose gear indicator light failed to illuminate. A seemingly trivial malfunction, just a light. It wasn't even a mechanical failure, but something that would soon grow into an unimaginable tragedy. The pilots, Captain Robert Loft and First Officer Don Repo, both highly experienced and well-respected, began to focus their attention on fixing the issue. Loft, the captain, made the decision to troubleshoot the problem, believing it could be resolved easily. But the distraction would prove fatal. As they worked to determine the cause of the faulty light, they became so focused on the malfunction that they failed to notice something more sinister occurring. The autopilot had disengaged, and the plane was slowly descending without anyone realizing it. It wasn't until it was too late that Loft and Repo realized their descent had become critical. The plane was falling, and before they could take action, Flight 401 crashed into the Florida Everglades. The crash was devastating. 101 people perished in an instant, including Captain Loft, First Officer Repo, and several other crew members. But what the survivors didn't know, what no one could have known, was that the crash was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Weeks after the crash, the survivors, trying to process the unimaginable trauma they had experienced, began hearing strange things. It started with the crew members. They spoke of eerie, inexplicable encounters while working on other flights. They were flying aircraft with parts salvaged from Flight 401, pieces from the ill-fated plane that had crashed in the Everglades. And as soon as they began to fly these planes, things started happening. At first, it was subtle, a strange feeling. A sudden drop in temperature, a shiver down the spine, as if someone was watching them from behind. But it didn't stop there. Stewardesses began to report sightings of a figure walking through the aisles of the planes, always in the same uniform, the one Captain Loft had worn the day of the crash. They said they saw him, standing near the galley, his face pale, expressionless. His eyes, they said, were cold, vacant, empty. They tried to approach him, to speak to him, but he never acknowledged them. He simply walked past them, vanishing the moment they turned their back. One stewardess, terrified, recounted seeing him standing by the stove as if he were preparing a meal. His hands hovered above the burner, motionless. She froze, watching in disbelief. And then, in an instant, he was gone, vanished into thin air. But that was only the beginning of the horrors. The crew members began to realize that it wasn't just Captain Loft they were seeing. First Officer Repo was also appearing, his presence just as unsettling. Repo's figure was seen in the galley as well, standing silently behind the bar, his eyes fixed on nothing, his hands frozen mid-air, as if he were still working. And when one stewardess tried to speak to him, to ask if he needed help, he turned toward her. His face was devoid of expression. Nothing but an empty, lifeless gaze, and then, just like that, he disappeared. The sightings didn't stop there. They spread to other planes, those equipped with parts from Flight 401. Pilots began to report hearing strange voices coming through the intercom system, voices that didn't belong to anyone they knew. The voices spoke of things they couldn't understand. One night, a pilot aboard a plane with parts from Flight 401 heard a voice over the intercom, a deep, hollow voice that sent a chill through his entire body. The voice spoke, but the words were unintelligible. It crackled through the static, chilling him to the core. When he checked the radio equipment, everything appeared normal. But the voice was there, speaking to him as if it knew him, as if it were familiar with the crew, with the aircraft. But there was something off about it, something wrong. And the words made no sense. A few nights later, another pilot flying a plane with Flight 401 seconds parts experienced something even more terrifying. He swore he saw a figure standing in the doorway of the cockpit, a figure dressed in Captain Loft's uniform. But when he looked closer, the figure had no face, just empty space where his features should have been. The pilot blinked. And when he looked again, the figure was gone. But what made the experience even more terrifying was the cold. The unnatural cold that filled the cockpit as the figure appeared. The pilot could feel it, the cold creeping into his skin, freezing him to the core. And it wasn't just the cockpit. The cold was everywhere. It followed him, no matter where he went. Then came the night that would forever change Jim Ross, a mechanic who worked on a plane that had parts from Flight 401. Alone in the cargo hold, Jim inspected the aircraft, unaware of what was about to happen. He was focused on his work, when suddenly, he felt it, someone was watching him. He turned around, expecting to see another worker, but there was no one there. But then, as his eyes scanned the hold, he saw something, two figures standing in the shadows. Tall figures, their faces obscured by the dim light. They wore the uniforms of Captain Loft and First Officer Repo. Jim's heart pounded in his chest. He felt his legs freeze, his breath catch in his throat. He called out to them, asking if they needed help, but they didn't answer. They didn't move. They just stared at him, their eyes dark and hollow. He couldn't tear his eyes away, and yet he couldn't look at them either. Their presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing on his chest. He took a step back, his body shaking. And then, in a voice that was not their own, a voice that was colder than anything he had ever heard, the figures spoke. The words were simple, but the tone was hollow, desperate. Help us find our way home. Jim didn't wait to hear more. He ran. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, but it didn't matter. He could still feel them, still hear the whisper of their words echoing in his mind. There are those who say that Flight 401 second's wreckage should have been left untouched, that the parts salvaged from the crash carried with them something far darker than anyone could understand. The souls of the dead had been trapped in the metal, their spirits unable to find peace. And for those who unknowingly flew aboard planes with parts from Flight 401, their nightmares had just begun. To this day, some believe that the ghosts of Captain Loft and First Officer Repo still roam the skies, waiting for the next flight, waiting for the next crew to board, waiting for the next unsuspecting passengers. So, the next time you board a plane, take a moment to look around, because you may not be flying alone. You may find yourself face to face with a ghost from the past, and when you do, you'll know. You'll know that the spirits of Flight 401 are still out there, and they're waiting for you.